I want to pull back to the really big picture, so I'm using words like civilizational here. You know, we all know that it isn't just Silicon Valley hype, that we and media are actually occupying the epicenter of the vast changes that are sweeping across the planet today. And we tend to roll our eyes at that. I'm sure, like me, you all rolled your eyes when you found out that Tesla's valuation is greater than that of Ford, which at some level is quite ridiculous, but at another level is quite telling of what's going on. And what I want to do is reflect on that a bit. The way I think about this is this moment in time, our age is defined by a race between two very different kinds of exponentials. There are exponential opportunities. We all know Moore's law, can calculate in our sleep. But there are other exponentials as well, and those are exponential challenges. So if these are the enablers of change, some of the challenges are things like atmospheric carbon. That's back to 8,000 BC to the present, and it's a little hard to see the exponential there because it's that vertical line way off at the end. It kind of looks like the boundary of the chart. And of course, we hope it's not the boundary of the chart and that there's lots of future there. In addition, we have the exponential of population growth on the same scale, about 2,000 years more. 10,000 BC, and the edge of the chart, of course, is the exponential today. And when you combine the two together, it always reminds me of Heraclitus' famous observation, nothing new ever comes into our lives without a hidden curse. And we have had vast opportunities, but we have had, perhaps not hidden, but overlooked challenges. You put them together, I wanted to reduce it to the essence of the modern condition. It's captured in two images. Some of you may recall the Loma fire last year, September. And what's amazing about this fire was a pot farm up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And a video or a UPS driver just happened to be driving by and caught this picture of it literally moments after the fire started. In addition, by coincidence, there was a California Department of Forestry helicopter there. And if you look way down in the lower right-hand corner, that's the helicopter. So the fire department actually was there and observing this, probably within 10 minutes of when this fire started. And so they got emergency response in full motion almost instantly the moment the fire started. And of course, the fire was instantly put out, right? Wrong. It took 15 days, burned nearly 5,000 acres, destroyed 26 structures, and you can read the rest of the statistics. The problem is quite simple. Fire, like Moore's law and other exponentials in our lives, expands exponentially. Emergency response, fire trucks, can only accelerate linearly. And so no matter how fast a fire truck is going, it is going to fall behind in the race against the exponential. And that's where we are today, is that our institutions, for the most part, are moving fast, but their linear responders are challenges or exponentials. Now, there are four possible outcomes to any exponential phenomena. I borrow this from King Hubbert, who made this observation in 1958. And he said, well, there are four kinds of futures. There are actually two classes of curves. There is true exponential, that's the line that goes upwards towards transformation. And then there are the other three lines, which are various variations on logistics curves. You know, most people in Silicon Valley draw everything like an exponential curve that goes upwards infinitely. This is why, especially in marketing plans, and it's why venture capitalists, as they say, sleep like babies. They sleep for 2 hours, wake up and cry. So you have steady state, sustainable recovery, and collapse. Well, steady state sort of looks like this. This is also from King Hubbert, 1956. The little pimple in the center is the oil age. And he said, if we switch to nuclear, we'll get a steady state energy future. By the way, some years later, he recanted and said, bad idea to use nuclear. That steady state future will, in fact, be solar. So that's what steady state looks like. And then, of course, a sustainable recovery would be like a organization. they're harvesting a forest and they suddenly realize they're harvesting the trees faster than they'll grow, and they say, let's back off and recover it and avoid the downward fall. And then there is collapse. You know, we have plenty of those in the valley, the dot-com bubble and the like. You know, there's a reason why our buildings are 2 stories high and surrounded by grass. So when companies fail and people jump, they just sprain their ankles. But the question is, are there any instances, true instances, of true exponentials that keep going upwards, that transformation, everything changes? And just think for a moment. Do we have? If you have an idea, just shout it out. What about the information revolution? The center of what we all do when touching media and information is, as far as I know, the only example I can think of true transformation, of something that is going upwards steadily enough that it won't turn into a logistics curve on any reasonable time frame. I mean, eventually it might. Which means you all are in a unique, privileged position to meet the exponential challenges of today, because you are touching the one thing that is truly exponential and not logistic. And I want to now give you a framework for how to think about this, how to think about exponentials, and how to think about how they have an impact on our world as a combination of fast and slow processes. And it's an idea that was articulated by my good friend Stuart Brand. It's in a book, The Clock of the Long Now, 1999. I sit on the board of the Long Now Foundation, and we use this chart a lot in our work. And he borrowed from architecture the notion of what are called shearing layers. That basically, the way to think about this is everything that exists in the present exists as an intersection of fast and slow processes. Think about this room. The thing that changes most quickly is who's sitting in the seats when, and a little more slowly is how the room's arranged. And slower than that would be the paint on the wall. And of course, the building, I actually remember standing in this room while it was under construction, and there was a large hole in the floor here. So it's, 10 years old. Buildings have a lifetime of about 55 years, and then, of course, property lines change the most slowly. So whenever you see something, you should ask yourself, what's the fast and slow parts? Now, the model here is that the top changes most quickly. Fashion is always changing. It's why we call it fashion. And down at the bottom, nature moves most slowly. And above nature, culture's a little faster, governance faster, yet infrastructure is faster as well. And events occur not only because of the impact of things moving around these layers. Events also, what I find is the most interesting things happen at the intersections between 2 layers. It's something to keep in mind, but let me give you an example. July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And the same year, we got the 4004, the first microprocessor. Really interesting coincidence. Except it was not a coincidence at all. The 2 events are deeply intertwined, and they are the consequence of things happening deeper down. Down at the level between culture and governance, we had the Cold War. Khrushchev, we will bury you, Borsky. And the result was a response of doing all sorts of things, among them saying we need an architecture for a secure communications network, and we need systems to control our rockets. And of course, then Kennedy famously said, we're going to put a man on the moon by 1969. And he told this to NASA, and they said, yes, sir. And when he left the room, they said, hey, you know, that's actually computational unobtainium. How are we going to do that? We need solid-state electronics. The result was that the government, the Air Force with its ICBMs and NASA with its moonshot, became the mother of all early adopters. And we all know what an early adopter is, someone who will pay way too much money for something that doesn't quite work. And as a result, it gave such a boost to the semiconductor industry that, in my opinion, we probably got the microprocessor 10 years ahead of when it would have arrived otherwise. So this whole suite of things up at the level of technology and commerce and working its way up into fashion, because of course that's what your cell phone is, all started because of a conflict down at the level of culture and governance. And that gives another insight to what's going on here. It's not so much the specific layers that matter, it's the boundaries between the two layers. So thanks to NASA, this is a picture of Jupiter at the mid-equatorial bands. And notice the nice little whorls there. That's Kelvin-Helmholtz instability, velocity shear between layers moving at different speeds. And that turbulence is very often productive turbulence. Think about in a biological environment where the most productive zones in biology are ecotones, boundaries between different biomes. In the ocean, the most productive zone are tide pools, that boundary between land and sea. And in Silicon Valley, the most interesting things, of course, happen right at the boundaries. Now, also, that kind of interference can be destructive. And let me give you an example. I was thinking about it yesterday because yesterday was a big anniversary of the 1906 quake. And so down at the level of nature, you have the San Andreas Fault, which they didn't even know existed until the 1906 quake. And nature moves very slowly, except when it doesn't. And in this case, nature moved rather quickly. The fault jumped 25 feet in a matter of seconds. And it led to a big impact up at the level of infrastructure, which caused, well, by the way, we call it the Great Earthquake and Fire of San Francisco because, in fact, most of San Francisco was destroyed by the U.S. Army. General Funston thought he had a really great idea to put a fire break along what's now Van Ness Avenue, and so he dynamited all along Van Ness, and it merely threw the embers over to the other side, and that's why San Francisco burned. So the quake starts, it goes up here, you have a little mistake in governance and infrastructure, we lose most of the city, but it doesn't stop there. Because what you see is normal order is things at the top move fast and things at the bottom move slowly. Revolutions happen when you have an inversion. Things at the bottom move more quickly. And then it just starts ping-ponging through. So we get the 06 quake, and then what happens is the 06 quake leads to the Panic of 1907. The headline, if you read this is the April, later in the same month, gold shipped to pay insurance losses. What had happened is San Francisco had burned right around the turn of the century, and they'd built what was considered to be the best fire department in the United States and put in cisterns. The insurers all noticed, and they said, hey, that's a great place to make an investment. So all the insurers, especially English insurers, were way long on fire insurance in San Francisco, but they didn't count on General Funston. And so the city burns, and all of a sudden everybody's collecting out. And all the banks, now, by the way, this is a time where the United States did not have a central bank. We were on the gold standard. Our de facto central bank was the Bank of England. And all of a sudden, England is having to shift gold back to California. And they said, wait a second, it's supposed to go the other way. And at one point they said, enough, we're not sending any more gold. It led to a global liquidity crisis and the Panic of 1907. So something way down here, a little earthquake fault, ping-pongs up, causes an infrastructure damage, which then hits commerce. And of course, the story doesn't stop there. That, in turn, led to the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 because everybody said, maybe we shouldn't count on the Bank of England being our de facto central bank. So keep that in mind. Normal order, fast on top, slow on bottom, but reverse order, slow from the bottom, heading upwards, and unpredictable things happen. So now just one other case study, well, also one lesson. I have to put this up, having it been the 1906 quake yesterday. Will and Ariel Durant put it nicely. Civilization exists by geologic consent, subject to revocation at any time. We all know Silicon Valley is not a valley, it's a graben. It is a downshifted spot between two of the most dangerous faults on the planet. We should be grateful for those faults. They are what create the geography of our area was determined by those faults, and that geography also determined the nature of how entrepreneurship happens here. So we should love the faults, but keep this in mind. So just another example of deeper layers and overlooked things. Here's a cyclic phenomenon, the sunspot cycle. It's very, very regular in its period, about 11 and a half years. Amplitude can change from time to time. You sort of ask yourself, well, what could the sunspot cycle possibly have to do with media and innovation and the future? Well, this is a case where if you combine fast and slow, a very regular 11-year cycle, with the fast cycle, the 18 to 24-month doubling of Moore's law, what is the consequence? And many of you in the room know this issue, but did anybody wake up this morning and wonder, because probably like me, you read about, you got the alert on sunspot AR 2644 yesterday, which blew off a rather large CME, fortunately not towards the Earth, and thinking, what might happen? Well, we know what might happen because it happened in 1859, the Carrington event. And we have the name for this was a fairly large CME that blew off the sun and washed over the Earth. We know it's called the Carrington event because there was a minor member of English nobility engaged in that most English of activities, staring at the sun. Fortunately, with filters, he said, whoa, dude, there's a big sunspot there. Well, 48 hours later, the CME hit Earth, and we had one primitive technology, pre-electronic technology at the time, called telegraph. And you all remember watching the cowboy movies and, being of an engineering bent, you wondered, why are the cowboys only pulling one wire on those poles? Well, it's because it's an earth ground. That's a big antenna. And so when the CME hit Earth, it did a couple things. One, there were auroras all the way down to the Caribbean. We didn't have to go up to Norway and freeze to see them. You could have laid on a beach with your pina colada and watched them. But also, telegraph offices were catching fire. That the operators couldn't touch the telegraphs, so they continued to click away. In Texas, there was a news story that there were 6 cows leaning against a barbed wire fence that got electrocuted and died. Who knows? It was Texas, but good story. But the telegraph wires really did turn into big antennas and soaked all of that up. Well, the question is, what would happen if we had another Carrington event today? It would be a media event for sure. We worried about EMP during the Cold War of setting off a thermonuclear device 200 miles above Iowa and blowing out our computers. If this happened today, our networks would go down, our SCADA systems would go down, our cell phones would probably burn out, our laptops wouldn't work, and of course people who use Windows machines wouldn't notice the difference. And you say, well, could that happen again? Could we get another Carrington event? That was 1859. The answer is, you betcha. You betcha. It's sort of been a quiet week on the sun. I pulled down the latest data yesterday. There's the CME that I was talking about. And we're coming right to the end of cycle 24. Things are kind of quiet, but there is actually a minor geomagnetic storm warning for tomorrow. Unfortunately, still no auroras here in Silicon Valley. But it happened, and it happened recently. We had a near miss in 2012. There was 2 CMEs that blew off the sun. If it had happened a week earlier, we would have had a Carrington-class event here on good old planet Earth. And then you say, well, how big a deal was that? They did a study. They estimated if that had hit the Earth, we would have had a $2.6 trillion impact on the U.S. economy with a 4 to 10 year recovery time. And what's the probability of that happening? The official probability is 10% in the next 10 years. So things at the bottom, slow-moving things at the bottom, can really catch us by surprise. Another case with interesting media implications. We all remember the Charlie Hebdo attack in January 2015. Now, admittedly, Charlie Hebdo is not exactly an example of brilliant media. Who here has seen Charlie Hebdo? Not exactly high literature. I had a whole bunch of French friends who never read Charlie Hebdo, and of course, immediately after that, they then said, well, we of course are in solidarity with Charlie Hebdo. So think about it. Was this the consequence of what was happening in what layer? Was it a culture clash of French freedom of expression versus Islamic piety? And of course, the response was Je suis Charlie. a bunch of people who never actually read this were walking around this way. And if McLuhan were here, he would remind us that it's a funny thing about media that the same message can have two very different meanings. For a liberal French citizen, this is, I stand for solidarity and freedom of expression. If you were a member of an Islamic minority or a Tunisian minority in Paris, you'd say, oh man, I can't believe my neighbors like that vulgar magazine as well. You can have different views. Revolutions, as I said, revolutions happen as turbulence between two layers. And the biggest revolutions happen when the lower layer moves more quickly at the top. And so thinking about that, where was all of this happening? Was this something bubbling up as a culture clash, Samuel Huntington from the bottom, or happening at the commerce level? And then the other question is, how deep? How deep is the origin of all this? Now, how many people in this room have heard people say, ISIS, they're medievalists. They're trying to bring back the caliphate and take us back to 800 AD and the like. And then the modern French. The modern French, je suis Charlie, personal expression and well, as a forecaster, I deal with indicators. And there was one funny indicator. This is Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marianne's dad, and he says, je suis Charlie Martel. Charlie the Hammer. Martel is a play on the word hammer. Was he talking about a French hip-hop group? And the like. No, of course not. He was invoking Charles Martel and an event in the past, specifically October 10th, 732 AD, the Battle of Tours, and in which Charlie, he's on the right, came into conflict with the governor of Al-Andalus, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, and it was a dispositive battle. If you go back and read your Gibbon, that the Islamic forces had come all the way up through Spain over the Pyrenees, and they were within about 100 kilometers of Paris. Charlie was an Australasian prince and carried the day in the battle. Abdullah Rahman died in the battle, and it is considered to be one of those turning events. It turns out that of course, Charlie, he got his name Charles Martel, Charlie the Hammer, because of this battle. He is considered the founding father of basically of the Middle Ages, and more importantly, his son Pepin was the first Carolingian king, and his grandson was Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire on Christmas Day, 800 AD. But what is a French politician invoking an event from 732 AD as if it was yesterday? It's not just because French are well-educated. Admittedly, have one candidate right now who actually has a PhD in hermeneutics. Imagine for a moment an American politician telling you that they had a PhD in hermeneutics, and oh, by the way, they're married to their high school English teacher, who's nearly 20 years older than he is. But the bottom line is that if you think about 732 AD, how far in the past is that? Think back to 1492. Columbus is 520 years in our past. But in fact, if Columbus was reflecting on the Battle of Tours, it was 765 years in his past. That very often when we see breaking events at the top level, they're being animated by things coming up from very deep levels. Or as F. Scott Fitzgerald once said, the past isn't history, it isn't even past. A lot of that stuff affects us. But now take the same issue, and I ask you, solve this problem. Solve the problem of suicide bombers. How would you stop them? I'll give you a couple of options. Should we do it at the level of commerce? Is unemployment the cause? Are jobs the solution? Show of hand. You can just raise your hand if you think that's the answer. Couple hands hesitantly. Infrastructure, we should put in more Jersey barriers. Hardened buildings. Anybody voting for that? Maybe nobody's voting. That is an American quality, by the way. Governance, maybe more policing, more political inclusiveness. Any candidates for that? Good, a few more hands. What about culture? Is Islam to blame? Is it the class of civilizations? Sam Huntington was right. It looks like the most. So your instinct is to kind of look down to the bottom here for solutions. Who thinks fashion is the answer? I knew you'd raise your hand. So, okay, who here in this room has ever been a teenage boy? Okay. And we're a little dense at figuring things out. Like probably when you were in high school, you thought the way to get a date was to drive a muscle car and listen to rock music, right? And it was only about 20 years later that you realized buying a VW Bug and carrying a copy of Proust in your pocket would be a better idea. Well, there are a bunch of 20-something males who cannot get dates, and they think it's like really cool to be a suicide bomber. So maybe the answer is to say, hey, dudes, it's like so uncool to, I'm watching my time, I got it, to be a suicide bomber. So let's use fashion. Does that sound like a good idea to anyone? Is anybody offended by that? Come on. At least someone must be mildly offended by what I just said. Well, that's exactly what Bono testified to in Congress. He said, send Amy Schumer and Chris Rock to find the Islamic State. Dudes, make fun of them and convince them not to do this. And then also in a variation on that, Chinese actress Li Bingbing a few years back said, just say no to ivory. And what happened in January of this year? The Chinese government banned the importation of ivory, and more importantly, for a whole class of nouveau riche Chinese, they're beginning to realize that having, the teeth of carved dead animals in their house is like totally uncool. And so the way to think about this is that if you think about these layers, the fast layers are like the fire trucks coming to solve a problem quickly. And the slower layers are where you put in permanent solutions. Of course, you have to tackle a problem like this at the level of culture, governance, and infrastructure, but fashion might be the way to buy yourself some time to get in the longer-term solutions. Changes at the top have rebound effects at the bottom. The classic instance of a media change at the top, and its effect was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. USSR was brought down by fax machines, samizdat video, and ultimately cellular telecommunications. But this is also interesting. November 1989 is a really interesting moment in time. Can anybody think of a media innovation that happened, a really obscure media innovation that happened in November, well, not right, quite November 1989, it was within 2 months, but in 1989? Really obscure arrived. It was, of course, Tim Berners-Lee's memo. And one question to ask yourself is, in 100 years when people look back on the late 1980s, which event will they remember more? The fall of the Berlin Wall or Tim's memo? That it takes time for us to sort out history and get answers. I'm always reminded, Zhou Enlai was once having dinner with Henry Kissinger when he was in China, opening up China, and the subject of the French Revolution came up, and Kissinger asked Zhou, well, what do you think of the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai paused and he said, well, it's a little too soon to tell. That's kind of how history works. I think history is going to remember this long after we forgot the Berlin Wall. But there is also a lesson in here about the power of media and the power of fast-moving things to also move slowly. Tim, we've kind of gotten into the trap of fast fashion in Silicon Valley. Facebook and, all the things we see and the quick buck and the like. And yet, the biggest impacts in media, the things that have had the biggest impact on our lives, are the people who've been information designers, who've built things that arrive slowly and last for a long time. Facebook's possible only because of the backdrop of what Sir Tim did. And we have other examples, of software designers. Vannevar Bush, the impact of this article in 1945 and the work he did we all need to develop the habit of working at the lower layers. Bush's impact was huge, and then, of course, it's impossible to not mention Doug Engelbart in this context, who, of course, was the Moses of cyberspace. And of course, his reward for thinking long-term was to have been profoundly misunderstood and ignored by everybody who was working up at the level of fast fashion. That's the price we pay. I want to close with one other example of media, the power of slow data. We know the power of fast, but a perfect example of power of slow data was what Charles Keeling did. Postdoc at Caltech, 1953, designed a precision gas manometer, started measuring atmospheric carbon. And everybody's like, what are you doing that for, man? And he said, well, it's interesting. Did his first research right here in Big Sur, discovered the diurnal pattern of carbon concentrations, and then in 1957 got IGY funding to begin his project of measuring on a continuous basis atmospheric carbon. And by the way, the IGY, the International Geophysical Year, was a classic example of productive conflict. It came out of the Cold War. The IGY was basically a cover for our intelligence agencies to spy on Russia by using scientists, but scientists didn't cost much money, so they gave them money and they did some good things besides. So you have that, and what did it lead to? Well, the Keeling curve. And it took a while for people to realize that what Charles Keeling was doing was extraordinarily important. And by the way, you can tell when they realized it because it was in the 1970s when NOAA and the Department of Energy and the NSF said to Keeling, great, thank you very much. We really appreciate your hard work. We're going to take it over now. And luckily, he managed to hang on to it. And by the way, the only break in the data was in 1964 during the congressional shutdown. Again, imagine for a moment what the climate debate would be like if we did not have this continuous record of carbon done by a scientist doing something that everybody thought was kind of weird. Watch out also when short-term opportunists wake up to the power of long-term work. They will generally try to appropriate it or kill it. And as a community, we should be on the alert to make sure that doesn't happen. So just to summarize, the dynamics between the pace layers, fast layers versus slow layers. Fast layers learn, slow layers remember. Fast fashion, 1980s, wow, photo gray lenses and double knit trousers were a really good idea. Slow layers said, I don't think they were a good idea, and hopefully they'll never come back. Fast layers propose, slow layers dispose. Fast layers absorb shocks, slow layers integrate shocks. An example of that would be the earthquake. The fast layer is the fire truck responding to the consequences of the earthquake. The slow layer is the urban planner saying, let's design our buildings so they don't collapse. And by the way, that's part of the challenge. Those two groups speak very different languages. What I see again and again in my work is most disagreements happen because people are operating on different time frames. And being explicit about the layer that you naturally occupy is a good thing. Fast layers are discontinuous, slow layers are continuous, fast layers innovate, slow layers constrain. So thinking about that one thing to notice is technology and science are not on this. I can talk to you why we don't have them on the model in the break, but the bottom line is take the general concept, don't follow these explicitly, treat this as a model and ask yourself, what's the layer of fast and slow that matters in your work, and how does it apply to the media we're looking at? This is where we are, Silicon Valley. So I was a member of the Air Force Science Board, and I am required by the conditions of having been a member to always invoke Theodore von Karman at least once in all talks. That little spot between the two big, so the great red spot here is just a big, steady hurricane. And there's a smaller storm, and that little channel between them is the von Karman vortex street. It spins off all these little whorls. Well, think about it. That big one, maybe that was Lockheed once upon a time, or HP, and that's Apple, and then there's Facebook, And the little whorls and medium-sized whorls are the unicorns, and maybe they will be lucky and grow up into big, big storms one day, or maybe they'll just evaporate. But the bottom line is that the little things come about because of the bigger, slower things. And that our fast change is riding on top of slow change. And if you want to understand the short term and find the short-term opportunities, you got to understand the long term. And I'll just close with one story in a plea for the importance of all of us to spend a little time thinking about long-term context. This is New College at Oxford, and New College pains me as a Cambridge grad to invoke a college at Oxford, but the New College at Oxford is not new. I think it was founded in 1387 or so. This is a story that Gregory Bateson told in the 1960s. I'm sure some of you know it, and let me put it in the phrase of something of a fable. About 100 years ago, the Dons were having dinner, and they noticed more than the usual amount of dust was filtering down from the ceiling, so they sent a building inspector, building surveyor up there. And of course, this being an old building has huge oak beams running the length of the building. And he came down and he said, well, you got beetles in your oak beams, and everybody knows oaks go to beetles, and so you're going to have to replace those beams. And Dons in 1900 were not any more effectual than Dons when I was a graduate student in Cambridge, and they thrashed around trying to figure out what to do. And of course, there was no Home Depot at the time, and you couldn't get those beams. And eventually, word filtered out to the college forester, who managed the college lands, because all Oxbridge colleges have their lands. And he went into the master's office. He said, well, your oaks are ready. And the master said, my oaks? He said, well, yeah, back when they built that building, your predecessor's 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 predecessor had a conversation with my predecessor's 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 predecessor. And even back then, everybody knew that oaks go to beetles. And so they agreed it would be a good idea to plant a forest of oaks. And each generation of my predecessors said, don't cut down them oaks. They's needed for the main hall. And your oaks are ready. So my lesson in my plea in closing is this: we all have to focus on the fast. We all have to pay attention to what is in our main field of vision every day. But it would be a very good idea to take a percentage of your time and make sure you plant a couple of acorns that might just grow up into oaks that you will never sit under. Thank you.